Thanksgiving was always a grand event at Margaret's house. My mother-in-law had a way of turning it into an extravagant, magazine-perfect holiday. The table would be adorned with fine china, the turkey golden and glistening at the center, and the dining room filled with laughter, stories, and the warmth of a family coming together. Everyone played their parts well, smiling, reminiscing, toasting to another year of blessings. And every year, I played along, too. I smiled through the polite conversations, ignored the subtle jabs, and reminded myself that I was part of this family now. Not for me, but for my husband, Daniel. For our son, Jacob. This year was supposed to be special. Jacob was 3 now, finally old enough to sit at the table with the rest of the family, to taste the mashed potatoes and pumpkin pie, to hear everyone tell him how much he had grown. He had been practicing his little, happy Thanksgiving, all week, his excitement bubbling over every time he spotted a turkey decoration in a store window. I couldn't wait to see his face light up when he was finally seated at that long, elegant table. But then Margaret sent the text. "We're keeping the guest list small this year. It'll just be immediate family. Hope you understand. Love you." I read it twice, then again, my mind struggling to process the words. Immediate family? Daniel, Jacob, and I were as immediate as it got. I frowned, my fingers already moving to call her. When she picked up, her voice was as bright as ever. "Michelle. How are you, dear?" "Margaret, I just got your text," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What do you mean by small guest list?" "Oh, honey, don't take it personally," she cooed. "We just thought it would be nice to have a quieter gathering this year. No little ones running around, you know? A peaceful dinner for the adults." A sharp, twisting feeling formed in my stomach. "So, you're saying Jacob isn't invited?" She let out a light-hearted laugh, as if I had said something ridiculous. "Oh, Michelle, don't be dramatic. It was just a joke." A joke. My grip on the phone tightened. "Margaret, this is his family. His home. You're really asking me to leave my son behind on Thanksgiving?" Now, she sighed, her patience thinning. "You and Daniel are still welcome. We're not excluding you, sweetheart." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her through the phone and make her understand what she was doing. But what was the point? Margaret had always found ways to make me feel like an outsider. Now, she was doing the same to my son. That night, I sat beside Daniel on the couch, reading the text out loud, waiting for his reaction. He sighed, rubbing his temples like he was already exhausted by the conversation. "Look," he said carefully, "my mom can be old-fashioned. She just wants a quiet dinner." I turned to him, stunned. "So, you're okay with this?" He hesitated. "I'll talk to her." I waited for him to pick up his phone. He never did. Thanksgiving morning, I dressed Jacob in the little sweater I had bought for the occasion, even though I knew now he wouldn't be going. He didn't understand why I was quieter than usual, why his dad was rushing around getting ready while I sat still, watching. He ran up to Daniel, smiling, his little voice filled with excitement. "Daddy, we go to Nana's now?" Daniel froze. I saw it then, how he looked at our son, how he hesitated, how guilt flickered across his face for the briefest moment. But it passed, and he knelt down, placing his hands on Jacob's shoulders. "Not this time, buddy. Mommy and I are going, but you get to stay home and have a special dinner with Mommy later." Jacob's smile faltered. His little brows furrowed. "But I want to go." I couldn't take it anymore. "You're staying with Mommy," I said firmly, standing up. "Because Mommy isn't going either." Daniel's head snapped toward me. "Michelle. I'm not leaving my son behind while his own family sits around a table pretending he doesn't exist," I cut in, my voice calm but sharp as glass. "If he's not welcome, I'm not welcome." Daniel ran a hand over his face, exhaling heavily. "Michelle, please. It's just one dinner. Let's not make this into a thing." I laughed bitterly. "Not make this into a thing?" She excluded our child, Daniel. And you're just letting it happen. His jaw clenched. He didn't have a real response to that, and we both knew it. He left without me. I watched from the window as his car backed out of the driveway, my son's tiny fingers curled around the hem of my sweater as he stared, confused. And that's when it hit me. I had spent years trying to belong, trying to win their approval, trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. I had swallowed the passive-aggressive comments, endured the judgment, ignored the way Margaret's eyes had always skimmed past me at family gatherings like I was an afterthought. And for what? So they could make my son feel the same way? No. I wasn't just an outsider in that family. I was disposable. And I was done pretending otherwise. Have you ever felt blindsided by someone you trusted? Comment 111 if you know that pain. Margaret never liked me. From the moment Daniel introduced me to his family, I knew I wasn't what they had envisioned for him. She was polite in a way that felt rehearsed, her smile just a little too tight, her compliments too carefully measured. She would ask me questions about my job, my family, my hobbies, but there was always this underlying air of judgment, as if she was waiting for me to say something that would confirm her suspicions, something that would prove I wasn't worthy of being with her son. I told myself I was imagining it. I tried so hard to believe that it wasn't personal, that I was just overanalyzing things. But as time went on, it became impossible to ignore. The passive-aggressive comments, the way she conveniently forgot to include me in conversations, the way her face would light up when Daniel's ex-girlfriend happened to show up at family events, it all added up. Still, I tried. I wanted to be accepted, to prove I was good enough. I brought her expensive wine for Christmas. I complimented her home, her cooking, her taste in everything. I even took a damn cooking class because she once made an offhand comment about how Daniel grew up eating gourmet meals and deserved a wife who could provide the same. None of it worked. Margaret never warmed to me. If anything, the more I tried, the more she seemed to enjoy watching me squirm. I think the moment I truly knew things would never change was the night Daniel proposed. It was a simple moment, just the two of us in our tiny apartment, but it was perfect. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to share the news. Margaret's response? "Oh, wow," she had said, her voice light and airy. I didn't think Daniel was ready for marriage yet. But I suppose if he's happy, that's what matters. Not a congratulations. Not even a fake smile. Just a subtle reminder that she didn't approve. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table that night, a silent plea to let it go. And I did. Because that's what I always did. I convinced myself that Margaret's approval didn't matter as long as Daniel and I loved each other. But I should have known better. The moment I became pregnant with Jacob, things got worse. Margaret acted as if the baby was hers, not mine. She inserted herself into every conversation about my pregnancy, treating me like some kind of unqualified vessel carrying her grandson. "Make sure you don't gain too much weight," she had warned me early on, eyeing my plate at dinner. "You don't want to have trouble losing it after." She criticized my nursery choices, scoffing at the theme I picked out. She even went as far as to buy a crib for her house, making it clear that she expected Jacob to spend just as much time with her as he did with me. And the worst part? Daniel never stood up for me. He brushed off my frustration, telling me she meant well. "That's just how she is," he'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But intent didn't matter. What mattered was how small she made me feel. How, little by little, she chipped away at my confidence as a wife, as a mother, as a person. I thought I could handle it, that I could continue keeping the peace, but Margaret always found new ways to remind me of my place. One day, when Jacob was about 6 months old, she came over unannounced, something she did often, as if my home was just an extension of hers. She waltzed in, completely ignoring the mess of bottles and laundry, and scooped Jacob into her arms with a delighted gasp. "There's my baby," she cooed, bouncing him on her hip. I forced a smile. He just went down for a nap, actually. I was trying to keep him on a schedule. Margaret waved me off, adjusting Jacob's little onesie as if I hadn't spoken. I swallowed my irritation. Margaret, I really need him to get some rest. Oh, stop worrying so much, she said, rolling her eyes. You're so uptight, Michelle. Babies don't need schedules, they need love. I clenched my fists, watching as she completely disregarded me in my own home. I turned to Daniel, silently pleading for him to back me up. But as always, he stayed out of it, busying himself in the kitchen while pretending not to hear. It was always like that. Margaret would do something hurtful, and Daniel would find a way to excuse it. I'd get upset, and suddenly I was the problem for making a big deal out of nothing. And for years, I let it happen. I let myself believe that if I just tried a little harder, if I made fewer waves, if I was more patient, she'd come around. But she never did. And sitting there on Thanksgiving night, feeding mashed potatoes to my son while my husband enjoyed a meal without us, I realized something I should have seen a long time ago. Margaret wasn't the only one who had been dismissing me all these years. Daniel had, too. The red flags had been there all along, but I had ignored them. The way he never defended me. The way he never challenged his mother, never reassured me that I was his priority. The way he let me carry the weight of keeping the peace while he simply coasted, always choosing the easier path, always siding with her by default. For so long, I had believed I was part of his family. But the truth was, I had never been anything more than an outsider. A tolerated presence. A convenience. And it had taken this Thanksgiving, this final, cruel exclusion, to make me see it. Because I wasn't just being overlooked anymore. I was being erased. A slow, simmering rage built in my chest, something I hadn't felt before. Not just frustration, not just sadness, rage. I wasn't going to let them make me feel this small anymore. I had been quiet for too long. That was about to change. Have you ever sacrificed so much for someone, only to feel like it meant nothing? Comment 222 below. Daniel came home late, the front door clicking shut with a quiet finality that sent a fresh wave of anger rolling through me. The house was still, except for the soft hum of the baby monitor in the corner, where Jacob's gentle breathing filled the silence. He had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up in his tiny bed, blissfully unaware of the betrayal that had taken place tonight. I was waiting. I sat on the couch, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, my phone still glowing in my lap. My heartbeat was steady, but my body felt rigid, coiled tight with the kind of fury that had no immediate release. Daniel didn't see me at first. He was too busy shrugging out of his coat, setting his keys down on the counter, sighing like a man who had simply endured a long, exhausting day. The scent of wine and roasted turkey clung to him, an unbearable reminder of everything I had been forced to miss. Finally, he turned and saw me. He hesitated for half a second, just long enough for guilt to flicker across his face before he tried to compose himself. "Michelle," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want to fight." I stared at him, my voice calm but ice cold. "Did you have fun?" He exhaled sharply, already defensive. "Michelle, please. It was just one dinner." Just one dinner. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned my phone toward him, the screen illuminating the space between us like a spotlight on his betrayal. Margaret was front and center in the photo, grinning, her wine glass raised in a toast. Daniel was seated next to his brother, laughing mid-conversation. The table was covered in a feast, perfectly golden turkey, dishes of stuffing and cranberry sauce, bowls of mashed potatoes and gravy. And at the center of it all? 2 booster seats. 2 little blonde heads. My sister-in-law's kids, their faces sticky with cranberry sauce, giggling, being doted on. Children who were apparently allowed at this adults-only dinner. I felt my voice break on a whisper. "Explain that." Daniel paled, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Michelle, I didn't wait for his excuse." I stood up, gripping my plate with both hands, and walked to the sink. Without hesitation, I lifted it and slammed it against the counter, the ceramic shattering into jagged pieces that scattered across the floor. The sound ricocheted through the house. Daniel flinched. Jesus, Michelle. But I wasn't finished. I grabbed another plate and let it slip from my fingers, watching as it fractured into shards at my feet. You let them exclude our son, I seethed, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. You let them pretend he didn't exist. And you sat there and ate turkey with them. Michelle, stop, Daniel pleaded, his hands lifting in some pathetic attempt to calm me. I didn't think. You didn't think? I cut him off, my laugh sharp and humorless. You sat at that table, surrounded by your family, while our son sat at home asking why he couldn't go. You knew how much this would hurt me. You knew, and you still went. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling roughly. I didn't know my sister's kids would be there, okay? Margaret told me it was just going to be adults. And when you saw them? I pressed. When you walked in and saw those booster seats at the table, what did you do? Did you stand up and say something? Did you demand that Jacob should be there too? He didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. He hadn't done anything. He had sat there, stuffed his face with turkey and wine, and pretended that everything was fine. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. You always do this, I whispered. You always choose them. That's not fair, he said quickly. I just didn't want to make a scene. I let out a slow breath, the weight of his words settling over me like a crushing force. That was what it always came down to, wasn't it? Daniel never wanted to make a scene. He never wanted to stand up to his mother, never wanted to cause waves, never wanted to disrupt the delicate balance that allowed him to exist in comfort while I bore the weight of every slight, every exclusion, every insult. And now, it wasn't just me he was throwing aside. It was our son. I turned away from him, pressing my hands against the cool surface of the counter, forcing myself to breathe, to think, to calm down. Behind me, Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Look, he said after a long pause, I get that you're upset. But can we just talk about this in the morning? I let out a slow, bitter laugh. He still didn't get it. He thought this was just another argument. That I would go to bed angry, wake up with a sigh, and let it go like I always did. But this wasn't just another fight. This was the fight. I turned back to him, my voice eerily steady. I want you to leave. Daniel frowned, caught off guard. Michelle. I mean it, I said, my voice harder this time. Go stay with your mother, since you clearly care more about her feelings than mine. That's not true, he argued. But I was already walking past him, heading for the hall closet. I pulled out an overnight bag and threw it at his feet. Go. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. For the first time, he looked scared. He stepped forward, reaching for me, but I backed away. Michelle, come on, he said, his voice lower now, softer, like he was trying to pacify a wild animal. You don't mean this. But I did. I meant every single word. Because I had spent years convincing myself that as long as I loved him, as long as we were happy, I could handle Margaret. That I could ignore the slights, the exclusions, the way she made me feel small. But this wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about him. It had always been about him. The way he let her get away with it. The way he let me suffer in silence. And now, the way he had let her make my son feel invisible. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest, and realized something that should have been obvious a long time ago. I wasn't angry because I had lost a battle tonight. I was angry because I had spent years fighting for something that was never mine to begin with. Daniel sighed, finally bending down to pick up the bag. He looked at me one last time, his expression uncertain. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. I didn't answer. I just stood there, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating, the front door opening, then closing behind him. The house was silent again. But this time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of something new. Something I should have chosen for myself a long, long time ago. What would you have done in my shoes? Comment 333 and let me know. When Daniel walked out that night, bag slung over his shoulder, I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty space he left behind. The house was quiet, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the pressure to keep the peace. There was nothing left to smooth over, nothing left to fix. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply started preparing. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For too long, I had let myself believe that things would get better, that Daniel would change, that Margaret would somehow soften. But they never had, and they never would. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving. This was about years of being dismissed, ignored, and pushed aside. It was about watching my son be treated as disposable, just as I had been. And I was done. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee as Jacob played with his blocks on the floor. My mind raced, sorting through everything I had accepted for far too long. Margaret's insults. Daniel's excuses. The way I had allowed them both to chip away at me, piece by piece, until I had nothing left of myself. Not anymore. That morning, I made a call to a lawyer. Sitting in that office later that week, my hand steady, my voice even, I laid it all out. The years of emotional neglect. The manipulation. The financial dependency Daniel had subtly created over time, making sure everything was in his name so that if I ever wanted to leave, I'd have nowhere to go. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. You have more power than you think. And that was all I needed to hear. I left that office with a plan. First, I started collecting receipts. I went through years of messages from Margaret, screenshots of texts where she mocked me, where she made it clear I wasn't good enough for her family. I found voicemails where she laughed about her jokes, where she spoke about me as if I wasn't even a real person, just some inconvenience she had to tolerate. I combed through our finances, making copies of everything, Daniel's bank statements, credit card bills, mortgage documents. I knew that when he realized I was serious, he would try to twist the narrative, make it seem like I was overreacting, like I was ungrateful. So I gathered proof. Not just for the court. For myself. Because when someone spends years making you feel small, it takes time to remind yourself that you were never the problem. Daniel, meanwhile, thought we were in a rough patch. He came back the next day with flowers, a forced smile, and the same tired lines. Michelle, come on. You know I love you. I let him talk. I nodded in all the right places. I let him believe that I was still the same woman who would bend, who would cave under the weight of guilt and obligation. But inside, I was already gone. A week later, I served him divorce papers. His reaction? Utter shock. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, as if I had just done something unthinkable. As if, after everything, I was the one betraying him. Michelle, he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. Don't do this. You're overreacting. Overreacting. It was almost funny. I had spent years underreacting. I had swallowed my feelings, made myself small, accepted every slight, every dismissal, every excuse. I had ignored every red flag, every gut feeling that told me I was losing myself. But I wasn't overreacting. I was finally reacting. And there was no going back. Daniel's shock quickly turned into anger. He paced the living room, running a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it. This isn't fair, he said, shaking his head. You're blowing this way out of proportion. My mom, she's just set in her ways. You know how she is. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. I don't care anymore, Daniel. He scoffed. What, so you're just throwing away our marriage over one bad Thanksgiving? I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw it, the desperation, the denial. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing the stability I had always given him. The quiet comfort of knowing I'd always be there, that I'd always forgive him, that no matter what he did or didn't do, I would stay. He was realizing, too late, that he had taken me for granted. "This isn't just about Thanksgiving," I said softly. "This is about everything." Daniel kept arguing, kept pleading, but I had already made my decision. He left that night, slamming the door behind him, and I sat in the quiet, my heart pounding, but not from fear. From relief. I had spent so many years waiting for someone to choose me. To fight for me. To stand by my side. But I finally understood. I was the one who had to choose myself. Have you ever had to stay silent while planning your next move? Comment 444 if you know that feeling. Margaret called me a week after Daniel left. I saw her name flash across my screen, and for a moment, I just stared at it. I could already hear her voice in my head, syrupy sweet, laced with condescension, pretending to be the concerned mother-in-law. She wasn't calling because she cared. She was calling because she had finally realized she had lost control. I let the phone ring twice before I answered. "Oh, Michelle, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice thick with artificial warmth. "I just heard the news. I can't tell you how devastated I am. We're family, and family should stick together during difficult times." I almost laughed. Family. The same woman who had spent years treating me like an outsider, the same woman who had made it clear, time and time again, that I would never truly belong. The same woman who had looked me in the eye and told me my son wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, my fingers drumming lightly against the cool surface. "Like you stuck by Jacob?" Silence. It was a loaded silence, the kind that confirmed she had been caught off guard, that she hadn't expected me to fight back. Margaret thrived on power plays, on being the one who dictated the terms of every conversation. Not this time. She recovered quickly, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Michelle, darling, I think we've had some misunderstandings over the years. But I never meant to hurt you." "Of course not," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It was all just a joke, right?" Another beat of silence. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I had endured, the years of biting my tongue, of being dismissed, of watching my son be treated as if he didn't matter. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface was now something else entirely. It was power. "Since you love jokes so much, Margaret," I said, my voice steady, "I have one for you." And then I dropped the bombshell. I had exposed her. Every text. Every insult. Every condescending message, every passive-aggressive dig, every joke at my expense. I had compiled them all, screenshots, voice recordings, receipts. And I had put them out for the world to see. Publicly. On social media. On every platform, she used to present herself as the perfect matriarch, the loving, devoted mother and grandmother. The reaction had been immediate. People were outraged. The comment sections flooded with disbelief and anger. Strangers called her out for her cruelty, for her blatant favoritism, for the way she had excluded her own grandson. The post went viral, shared and reshared, dissected and discussed. She had spent years controlling the narrative, making me feel small, making me feel like I was the problem. But now, she had no control. Her reputation? Shattered. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath, her composure finally cracking. You didn't." "Oh, but I did." I could practically hear her scrambling for damage control, trying to calculate how to fix this. But there was no fixing it. The world had seen her for who she really was. "You had no right," she hissed, the fake sweetness stripped away. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Neither did you." I hung up before she could say another word. And God, it felt good. Daniel showed up at the house 2 days later, looking haggard. I knew he had seen it, too. His mother's reputation was in ruins, and by association, so was his. The golden son who had always stood by her side was now a man whose silence had enabled her cruelty. His friends, his colleagues, hell, even his extended family, had all seen the truth laid bare. He had spent so many years choosing his mother over me, over our son. And now, he had lost us both. His eyes were bloodshot as he stood on the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Michelle," he started, his voice rough, "can we talk?" I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "There's nothing left to talk about." His jaw tensed. "You went too far." I let out a slow breath, tilting my head as I studied him. "Too far?" I echoed. "Was it too far when your mother made me feel like I didn't belong in my own marriage? When she dismissed me as a mother? When she erased our son from her family?" Daniel flinched. He knew I was right. He just didn't want to admit it. "I didn't think it would go this far," he muttered. That, right there. That was the problem. He never thought things would go this far, because it never affected him. He had never been the one excluded, belittled, humiliated. It had always been me. And now that he was finally feeling the consequences, now he thought it was too far. I folded my arms. "You made your choices, Daniel. And now, you get to live with them." His shoulders slumped. "I lost my job." I didn't blink. I knew his company prided itself on image. The last thing they wanted was bad press, and Daniel, by standing by his mother, had aligned himself with her actions. "That's not my problem," I said, my voice even. "Michelle, come on," he pleaded. "I know I screwed up. I know I should have stood up for you. But you didn't," I cut in. "You didn't stand up for me. You didn't stand up for Jacob. You let this happen." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. I didn't think I'd lose everything." I let his words settle between us. He had lost his reputation. His marriage. His job. His family. Meanwhile, I had gained something I hadn't had in years. Freedom. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of the past finally lifting from me. "I got full custody," I said, watching his face closely. His expression crumbled. "Michelle, please," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't do this." But I had already done it. I had given him chance after chance to be the man he had promised to be. To be a father. A husband. A partner. And every single time, he had chosen his mother instead. I reached for the doorknob, pausing just long enough to meet his eyes. "Goodbye, Daniel." I stepped inside and shut the door, locking it behind me. For the first time in years, I felt safe. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Jacob toddled into the hallway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Mommy?" I bent down, scooping him into my arms. He was my family. And we were finally free. Do you think they got what they deserved? Comment 555 if you felt that justice was served. The first morning in our new home, I woke up before the sun. For a long time, I just lay there, listening to the unfamiliar silence. It wasn't the silence I had grown used to, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken resentment, with the weight of trying too hard and getting nothing in return. This silence was peaceful. It was clean, unburdened. I turned my head to the small bed beside mine, where Jacob was still fast asleep, his little hands curled into fists, his lips slightly parted. His chest rose and fell with soft, even breaths, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to fully exhale. We had made it. For weeks, I had been running on adrenaline, moving through every legal meeting, every final confrontation, every last shred of paperwork with a numb, detached determination. There had been no time to process, no space to feel. But now, here in this tiny but bright apartment, with no one telling me I wasn't enough, no one hovering over my choices, no one waiting for me to shrink, everything felt real. I was free. Jacob stirred, rubbing his sleepy eyes as he blinked up at me. "Morning, Mommy." I smiled, brushing the hair off his forehead. "Morning, sweetheart." He yawned and stretched, before settling into my arms. I held him close, pressing my lips to the top of his head. This was all that mattered. We had left behind the house that never felt like mine, the family that never accepted me, the marriage that had only ever asked me to sacrifice more and more of myself. And in return, I had gained something priceless. A fresh start. Moving into a new place with a toddler wasn't easy. There were still boxes stacked against the walls, unopened, waiting for a moment when I wasn't chasing after a 3-year-old or trying to figure out how to rebuild my life from scratch. I wasn't just starting over emotionally, I was starting over financially, mentally, in every possible way. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of hard work. Daniel had always made me feel like I needed him. Like I wasn't capable of doing this alone. And Margaret? She had made sure to reinforce that belief every chance she got, slipping little barbs into conversation, reminding me of all the ways I fell short. But now, I was the one assembling Jacob's new bed. I was the one setting up our tiny kitchen table, making grocery lists, budgeting every dollar carefully because, for the first time in years, I had control over my own finances. Every paycheck, every bill paid, every small step toward stability, it was mine. I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to worry about walking on eggshells, about being too much or not enough. There was no one left to disappoint. And that realization was more liberating than I could put into words. But healing isn't instant. There were moments, late at night, when the apartment was too quiet and the weight of everything I had lost pressed down on me, when the grief hit. Because as much as I hated Margaret, as much as I resented Daniel, I hadn't wanted my marriage to fail. I hadn't wanted Jacob to grow up without both parents under the same roof. I hadn't wanted to be alone. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to belong in a family that had never really wanted me there. The way I had begged, silently and out loud, for someone to stand up for me. The way I had clung to hope, convinced that if I just did everything right, things would change. And the hardest thing to accept? I had wasted so much time trying to prove my worth to people who were never going to see it. That realization was both painful and freeing. Because now, I wasn't wasting my time anymore. Now, I was pouring everything I had into building a better life for Jacob and myself. And every time I saw him laughing, every time he ran into my arms and told me he loved me, every time we sat together in our little apartment, eating grilled cheese sandwiches on the floor because we didn't have a couch yet, it was enough. More than enough. The first time I took Jacob to the park in our new neighborhood, it felt like a milestone. He ran ahead of me, his tiny legs moving as fast as they could, his laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. I watched him climb up the slide, his cheeks flushed with excitement, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't worried about what Margaret would say. I wasn't waiting for Daniel to disappoint me again. I wasn't carrying the constant, exhausting weight of being unwanted. I was just here, in this moment, with my son. A mother. A woman who had fought like hell to reclaim her life. A woman who had won. One night, after putting Jacob to bed, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The apartment was small, modest, nothing like the house I had lived in before. But it was mine. I had chosen this life, built it with my own hands, step by step. For so long, I had believed that staying in my marriage, enduring Margaret's cruelty, swallowing my own pain, was the price I had to pay for stability, for love, for family. But I had been wrong. Leaving wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel disposable. I felt free. Have you ever had to walk away from someone to protect yourself? Comment 666 if you've made that choice. For a long time, I thought love meant endurance. I believed that if I could just be patient, if I could keep the peace, if I could prove my worth, eventually, I would be accepted. That Margaret would see me as family. That Daniel would finally put me first. That all the sacrifices, all the moments I swallowed my pain, all the times I chose silence over confrontation, would mean something in the end. But life has a way of teaching you lessons you don't want to learn. I spent years trying to mold myself into the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect woman who didn't ask for too much, didn't push back too hard, didn't make things difficult. I made excuses for people who never made any for me. I tolerated mistreatment because I was terrified of losing the life I had built, even if that life was suffocating me. Then came Thanksgiving. The moment that shattered the illusion I had been holding on to for so long. The moment I saw my child being erased, dismissed the same way I had been for years. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I finally asked myself the question I should have asked a long time ago: why was I fighting so hard for a place in a family that never truly wanted me there? That was the beginning of everything. Walking away wasn't easy. Starting over wasn't easy. But choosing myself, choosing my son, was the only choice that ever should have mattered. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about worth. For so long, I believed my worth was something I had to prove, something I had to earn by enduring hardship, by forgiving the unforgivable, by waiting for people to change. But the truth is, self-worth isn't something you win through suffering. It's something you reclaim the moment you decide you are done settling for less than you deserve. Because when you finally realize you deserve better, you stop waiting. You stop waiting for apologies that will never come. You stop waiting for people to wake up and see your value. You stop waiting for someone to love you the way you should have been loving yourself all along. You start choosing you. And that is the greatest power of all. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: you are not obligated to stay where you are not valued. You do not have to prove yourself to people who refuse to see you. You are allowed to walk away from toxic relationships, whether it's a marriage, a family dynamic, or a friendship that drains you more than it fills you. And when you do, when you finally step away from the people who made you question your worth, that's when you find yourself again. So now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight to reclaim your power? Have you ever walked away from something or someone that no longer served you? Share your story in the comments below. I know there's someone out there who needs to hear it. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt unseen, unappreciated, or trapped in a life that wasn't meant for you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs this message. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to remind you that you are not alone. And that you, too, deserve better.